Good morning. Is that clear? What's that? Sound okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. I'd just like to start by repeating some of the points that Ginta made yesterday morning, which I thought were very pertinent to us today. And this idea that buildings change. And I think today and yesterday we've all been looking at the first phase in terms of recreating that. And in a lot of cases, we can actually say that the conservation or the recreation of the first phase is actually the most significant phase in the building's sort of life story. But if we accept that buildings change, and like buildings have a biography and a life story, and I said yesterday that as a building analyst, I sort of see myself as a vehicle for explaining that change. So this idea of data is very important. So we're gathering data, and it's how we use that data. And so maybe as conservators, we should be asking how do we communicate the data, not just how we use it, because we have privileged access to buildings. So we have a responsibility to communicate this in an effective way to people who perhaps not as technically minded as ourselves. So I think I'll be concentrating on not just how we acquire the data, but maybe some of the case studies I'll be showing show about communicating data. And actually, for young conservators starting off in their career, think of yourselves as a facilitator helping in the decision-making process. And maybe tutors, when you're interviewing candidates for your conservation courses, you're not just looking for people with manual dexterity, perhaps you're looking for people who are very outgoing, people who are very good listeners, people who are very good communicators, because I think in the future that's where the strength of being conservative is going to be. So I'm hoping I'm going to deal with some of these issues. Now, when Ginta invited me to get involved with this, I thought, I've given a paper in this subject. And it was even published, and this is the conservation of 20th century buildings. But then I was dismayed when I looked at the date, and it's 1993. That was almost 20 years ago. So I got my article out and read it, and actually it's the version, that was then, this is now, and we were really excited at this conference, because it was the first ever conference dealing with the conservation and repair of 20th century buildings to be held in the UK. And I think we've obviously travelled because we were so excited by the fact that buildings weren't white, they were polychrome, so that was the sort of the zing of our conference. And I was obviously very taken by the fact that I was using paint research techniques which we normally use on 18th and 19th century buildings on 20th century buildings, so I was very excited about that. And I was gratified to find that the younger me had started the article by saying, architectural paint research can be divided into two distinct operations, documentation and the conservation and recreation process. And I think that's how we should see ourselves. And they're two distinct things. We can document these buildings, and then we use that data to devise a design process. I mean, the 5 phases that we were going through this morning. Now, my paper, I'll just deal with this, was the Mendelssohn Cheremicha Delaware Pavilion at Bexhill. Now, I was asked to comment on the colour applied to the balustrading, the metal balustrading around the front. And they wanted me to tell them, was it light blue or dark blue? And actually it was quite simple, because from the documentation you could see the original intention of the architects was to have bronze balustrading, but they couldn't afford that, so it's iron balustrading that's been painted brown. Now you can imagine brown paint in 1930 facing the English Channel would not survive. So the paint samples I took were like a ghost of the brown. But we did find a trace of the brown. And we went back to the original brown. But actually, looking back at it, it's very sombre, and Bexhill is a seaside town. And blue railings would have been quite jolly. You know, seaside blue railings. So I think the architects were quite disappointed. I was saying, it was this thing. I said it wasn't a brown, so it wasn't a blue, so we had to go for a brown. But what I'm saying is that a lot of choices were made through the life of the building, and somebody liked the blue and repeated the blue, and it continued to be blue for most of the later part of the 20th century. But we came back without much discussion and put the brown back. Another project I worked on this time was Pullman Court, and this was from the 1930s again, and there were 3 blocks. And I was actually rang up by Christopher Dean of Docomomo, you might remember him, and he pleaded with me to come down and take some samples because the paint was being stripped off these 3 blocks because there was a problem with the concrete and they had to strip all the layers off. Now that's fine for the structural repair, but it was the loss of evidence. And Christopher Dean said, when these were first built, the first 2 blocks were decorated in shades of orange and the back block was decorated in shades of blue. So we got on site and we said, you know, you are potentially removing all of this evidence. And someone said, even though the descriptions of the block had been written in contemporary architectural journals of the time, saying it is orange, it is blue, they said, no, that was just a design intention. And so ingrained was the idea that these were white and they'd always been white, that after we were on site and all the sandblasting was going, we could actually say, look, you can see the orange paint that you're stripping off. So that was then, but this is now, and now everybody is quite happy to know that Pullman Court might be white now, but it was originally orange and brown and blue. But it still makes us think, if people like them white, can't we let them have them white? Do we have to impose this on them? Controversy, I won't go into too much detail about that, but the Guggenheim, we started the Guggenheim Museum there. A lot of research has been done at Columbia University in Philadelphia University, and they've established Frank Lloyd Wright's original colour. And so the idea is to recreate that. But the local community, and you can imagine, Upper East Side millionaires who live next to the Guggenheim Museum, they like the colour that they've known. They like the white colour. They don't want it to be this few shades darker magnolia. So there's a vociferous argument about that. Now I would say that the local stakeholders have as much say as the researchers in Columbia and Philadelphia who are coming up with the original colour. You know? I think we have to this idea of engaging stakeholders in the debate is very important. Now, I'm going to be thinking, why is she showing us an 18th century British church? And I'm saying that I'm looking at the decisions we're making now about things that happened then. So I'm very much looking at stakeholders and decisions and the decision-making process. Now, this is simple as Deptford. Deptford's a very run-down part of London. And to invigorate the area, Heritage Lottery Fund was giving hundreds of thousands of pounds to this church, and they decided without any consultation with the local population in the area that the original scheme was going to be recreated within the church. Now you can see some of the stakeholders in the picture. Winos. And the local vicar, his main aim is to open the basement and provide down and out poor people, such as these, with hot food. The actual congregation that attend the church, very small, and there's a core group of about 5 little old ladies who go in and clean it. Were they consulted about the reconstruction of the original scheme? No, they weren't. Anyway, we pushed ahead. And I was very proud of myself because I established that the church was completed in 1710, but the organ hadn't been installed until 1720. So by simply going up behind the organ, I found the original decoration. And to our surprise, we found that the original wall faces and the stone capitals hadn't been painted at all. The organ had protected this original unpainted finish, very stark, and you can see where the painters had actually worked their brushes behind the organ, and you can see the modern paint that dates from the 1970s and the gold. And I'm sorry, I haven't got a photograph of the original, the church as it was when we were doing our research in the 90s, but it was white and it was gold, and the ceiling was picked out in very blue, pretty blue panels, and the ladies who cleaned the church liked that. Here's another example. For us, this is the paint that had been accumulated on the walls and the corners since 1720 20 and beyond. And this is the original crisp moulding and the wall face unpainted. So this was a revelation for us experts. We thought this was wonderful. Enjoy. But meanwhile, we were pressing ahead and established the original colours of the doors. And we painted them this light shade of brown, which is historically accurate, without any consultation with the community. Right, so one morning we arrived, and this graffiti on the door. And I'll just translate. "Excuse me, mate, would you like to look like the contents of a baby's nappy?" So, paint colour is a very emotive issue. Anyway, we revised the colour and made it a much more neutral dark brown. So, community action and power there. So, to get on to another sort of community, this summer, we're having the Olympics in London. And of course, everything has to be repainted because of the Olympics. So, I was asked to research the railings of Canada House. Now, Canada House is now owned by the Canadian government. It's one of their official offices. But you can see it's in Trafalgar Square. So actually, Canada House forms the west side of Trafalgar Square. So you can see all the stakeholders involved in this, the adjacent buildings, but the people who are making the decision are obviously the Canadian government, Westminster Council and English Heritage, because it's an important building. So actually, black railings. If you've been to London, you realise that London is a city with black railings and white joinery. Now, I could ask Patrick, Patrick, these railings date from 1828. What's the original colour? So, anyway, I obliged to establish this colour. So I'm saying this is London. And you can see that the rest of Trafalgar Square is bordered by black railings. But also, a little bit of information for you about London. The myth of the black railings in Britain, right? So the myth is, this is the myth, in December 1861, the country was shocked by the news of Prince Albert's sudden death. He died of typhoid in his mid-50s. "Paint everything black," proclaimed the grief-stricken Queen, Victoria, and from that day forward, all the railings in the land were painted black. Well, that's how the story goes, but it's not true. But you cannot kill that myth. That myth is alive and well. The facts, and Harriet will back me up here, the story of Queen Victoria and the black railings is a popular urban myth. Black did not become the default colour for the decoration of railings until almost 100 years later, during the late 1950s or possibly 60s. The sudden appearance of black railings is directly linked to the availability of a new fast-drying alkyd resin paint at this time. Before this time, decorators would paint everything dark green because it dried more quickly. So there's my sample. So you can see the black paint, modern. You can recognise alkyd resin paints by this sort of thinness, the uniformity of the stains, and it's only when we get down here that we're getting to the green decoration. And also you'll notice the repeated gilding here. Now, this is a sample I've taken from one of the spines at the top of the gill. So actually, if we look at another sample, here's the gilding. So you can see the grey undercoat, the original green, and the original, that's the gold size and the original gold. Now, railings are normally decorated between about 7 and 10 years, but gilding is very hard wearing, and you would retain your gilding for as long as possible. So this accounts for why we haven't got many green decorations here, because the gold's protecting the paint. So this is a more typical sample taken from the railings of Canada House. And you can see, as Patrick says, dark green, dark green, dark green. And the dark greens go up until we get the introduction of the black alkyd resin paints, possibly in the 1960s. And here I've done a little bit of revealing, and you can see the gilding here. So, and here's a little mock-up in Photoshop. So I established the green, the placement of the gold. Now, you have to think, in 1828, green was a very exciting new colour. Chrome green had just been invented, and when mixed with Prussian blue, meant that you could get a very nice, bright green at an affordable price. And so, in the context of 1828, green was exciting. Green was exciting. But then, as the years went by, and the pollution levels in London were so bad that even if people were trying to reproduce that colour, they were producing it with grime on it. So that's why we get the gradual darkening of it as we go. But there might actually have been a taste for a more darker green as the excitement of the bright green of 1828 faded. So, but just look at the context of these railings. See, we've got the black railings here, but we've got black railings around the National Gallery, St Martin's in the Field. So, what's the choice that the Canadian Government, Westminster Council and English Heritage are going to come to? So here I am, I'm trying to provide the data as simply as possible. So I've identified the main sort of phases, I've identified the dates, I've even numbered the type, the decorations that were applied, and you can sort of see in a sort of coloured chart I've identified the drift to darker green, and then we get the black. And then I've given them options for their decision. I'm not making the decision, I'm letting the clients make the decision. Option 1, we can recreate the original one. Option 2, it's getting darker. Option 3, no gold. Option 4, the black and white railings that we live with now. Now, what do you think they went with? They went with this. But I had to provide them with the darkest green commercially available. They thought the gold was going to be a bit ostentatious and difficult to maintain. I'll refute that. But you can sort of see how, and something I'm within the remit of this conference, because I'm talking about decisions and polychrome applied in the 20th century. So let's just sort of have a look at how we got here in conservation terms. So in England, as a conservator, you are taught about John Ruskin's. And I think John Ruskin still dominates our thinking. Do not let us talk of restoration, the thing is alive from beginning to end. Now that's really sort of damned anyone, you know. In England, if you call someone a restorer, they can sue you, I think. You have to be conservative. Even though I'm an accredited conservative restorer, which kind of acknowledges that I stabilise things and then I make interventions to make it usable. But things are changing from that John Ruskin period. So English Heritage recently published brand new conservation principles, which I think are very good and workable, and they define conservation as the management of change. Now, we've been talking a lot this morning about keeping things the same, but I think we all admit that sometimes to keep things the same, we have to change them, but in a managed, orderly way. So there's lots of new principles now that are quite challenging, that it's the idea of values and identifying values, and there can be a different range of values. That the historic environment is a shared resource, that as experts we have to engage other people in the excitement of that resource, that everyone will be able to participate in sustaining the historic environment, and decisions about change must be reasonable, transparent and consistent, and documenting and learning from decisions is essential. So what is cultural heritage? Well, we're sort of talking in a very sort of Western European context here, but do our principles, what we're talking about, would they stand up in other countries? So objects collected by Western connoisseurs and put them in museums, the weight of Europe. And I think we tend to kind of transport this to other parts of the world where they don't really work. We have to consider the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples and First Nations, the idea of living heritage, and the other idea of intangible heritage as something that really, as conservators, we have to engage and accept and incorporate into our world. So who decides? Now, the decision-making process. Now, I know as conservators we've all lots of familiar faces here, and we've all sort of, around the coffee breaks, we all talk about hidden hierarchies and power structures within the cultural heritage system. We never talk about them on the podium here. But ICOM sort of realised that as conservators we're sometimes excluded from the decision-making process. We are the people who simply mend the pots. And Chris Capel, conservative in England, says, we conservatives are invariably focused on how and not why we are doing this. We stand uncertain and mute as decisions are made. Why is this? So ICROM ran a very innovative course called Sharing Conservation Decisions, and they ran it in 2004, 2006, 2008. And the idea was to get conservators, sort of mid-career conservators, to Rome, and then just expose them to all the decision-making mechanisms with the hope that they would go back to their respective countries and sort of all this new thinking would filter through. And so I was privileged to go on the 2006 course, so we had 1 month of very heady experiences of looking at all various international projects, speakers from all over the world. And so we looked at the history of conservation. So I was familiar with Ruskin, familiar with William Morris that Ivo was talking about, and this idea of materiality. And then we violently do. Now, in England, we are very scornful of him. He's Disneyfied castles and invented things. But in a way, his restoration had a validity. To restore is to re-establish in a finished state which may never have existed. And we can sort of see in any recreation process we do, we're actually filling in gaps for the public or the user so the object or the building can actually function in a way. And I think we shouldn't deny that's part of what we do as a conservative restorer. So we're a bit of both. Right, so two opposite and incompatible conceptions of heritage conservation in the 19th century. How could these be reconciled? So we've got the classical theory of conservation. Now, Camille Boito. Now, I must admit, until I went to I hadn't heard of him, and all my Italian friends were saying, "What? You haven't heard of Camille Boito?" Now, he realised the tension between Ruskin's perspective, restoration, conservation, Val-le-Duc, symbolising restoration, and so Camille wrote a book called Conservation or Restoration, and it's a dialogue between two characters who represented Ruskin and Val-le-Duc. And these two characters have a conversation and they reach an agreement and produce guidelines for conservation. And they both admit the importance of doubt. Now, a lot of speakers have been talking about humility and doubt. Very important as a conservator. But it wasn't published in English, so I didn't know about him and we tended to ignore him. But obviously, all the people here speak lots of languages are aware of this. But this book was a great influence on the thinking about conservation and conservation charters, especially the first one, the Athens Charter of 1931. And then Brandy. Now, coming from England, I must admit that we are very scared of Brandy because, first of all, he was very rude about the National Gallery's cleaning policy of our oil paintings, and he wrote a book called The Conservation, the Theory of Restoration. So English people are very scared about the word theory, and you know what we think about the word restoration. So, and it was in Italian as well. But Brandy's ideas are very important, and as other speakers have made a point, that we restore only the matter of the work. As conservators, we work with the materiality of it, but the value of an object is determined by people and contexts, and these can constantly change. So it's the physicality of the object, the materiality of the object, but it all depends on the values we place on it. I mean, if I said this was used by Napoleon, it's suddenly very valuable because we put that value on it. If it's not used by Napoleon, we throw it in. You know. So I wrote an article, and I tried to summarise the experience I had from the ICROM course called Who's Afraid of Cesare Brandy? Of course, I am. So anyway, so you can get this in Icon News, or it's on my website as well. And so I think then what I started to do when I was involved with the project was look beyond the physicality of this. You can see the conservation problems of this room. You know, I don't have to go into it. But you can also see the body language of the two parties. Now, the man in the green hat, he is the local authority. He wants to decorate this room so it's bright and fresh. This is an English heritage inspector. He wants to retain the archaeological evidence. And this is the poor architect, conservation architect, trying to sort of... but I think by understanding that they both wanted the room to work, he wanted to retain the signs of age, he wanted to make it nice for the public. And we found by our conservation programme, very minimal in painting, we could make both parties happy. So I think it's looking behind and understanding the values and what's important to various stakeholders is a solution, and conservators can actually, bring peace, I would say. So you can sort of see conservation battling, but at the end, they resolved it. Now, this is a little chart which is very useful if you think about how we operate. Now, you can see that maybe as conservators we are quite obsessed with material-based conservation. Now, this means that it's decoded by experts, and then we have top-down decision-making process. And you can sort of see all this approach is upheld by the charters, from the Athens Charter, the Venice Charter, all of these charters early on. And it's all based on expert values, where the welfare of the material heritage takes precedence over contemporary needs. Then we have a change in charters, and we Borough Charter, Narrow Charter, documented implicity, and this is heritage values ascribed by expert in consultation with stakeholders. Expert-led, and it's still sort of bottomed down. And I think we've all had those. In British summers, you can't actually depend on the weather, so to have an important ceremony, you have to have a shelter from the rain. So you can sort of see a lot of change is happening to the physicality of the building, but it's ensuring the continuity of the intangible heritage and the values that are associated with the building. So I think this way of thinking is going to require that we think again about what our involvement is with the object and the communities and the stakeholders. Now, this is being entrenched in law now. I have to address this as an English conservator. There is a transfer of local authority heritage assets to community groups. Now, that might fill any profession with horror, because it says bad enough communicating with local authority professionals, but I'm going to be dealing with complete amateurs. What's going to happen? What is my role in this? And the English Heritage guidance that there's no standard template for the process of dealing with communities. It can be difficult, and I can see from yesterday's papers that dealing with the decoration of the buildings in Berlin obviously took a lot of time and effort and community involvement. So ICCROM is also thinking about these problems too. And this, 2011 wrong date, they had a review of their successive conservation decision-making conferences. So they invited past participants to offer a review and also look to the future and what conservation requires. So I'm just going to give you a sort of a snapshot of some of the ideas from people all around the world. So if we look at the different approaches to conservation that we have, we're obsessed, or one of our main ideas is the preservation of original materials, the restoration of original form, recreation in some way, and the consolidations of materials, but also the consolidation of social networks and values that are related to the object. We can sort of see there's an emergence of participatory practices and a kind of honesty about the burden of the West on other societies. They exported through colonial experiences. This is Marie Berdicou from Paris. Conservation in Europe at the beginning of the 21st century, we have to move our way of thinking to engage people with heritage assets. It's not good enough just to sort of fossilise them and say, oh, this is significant, but you can't go in, you can't touch. That doesn't work, it's not sustainable. From Denmark, decision-making based on dialogue. So this paper was saying how difficult it was for the Conservatives to talk to the church authorities, to the local authorities and the stakeholders, and mechanisms for making this dialogue successful. South America, engaging communities in heritage processes, challenges and opportunities. So everyone's addressing this problem. And just to show you this little joke. It's about sometimes how experts sort of come in and they don't really know what they're talking about. So this is the expert, and this is the sort of computer geek. He said, I think we should build an SQL database. And the man's thinking, what's the name? And he's thinking, does he understand what he said, or is it something he saw in a trade magazine ad? So then the computer man turns around to him and says, what colour do you want the database? And the man says, I think mauve has more RAM. And sometimes I feel that we don't know what we're talking about, so we have to engage and ask questions. So, Living Heritage Science Programme. What's the problem? Often, the problem is identified as experts being helicoptered in, imposing decisions and things on the community, and then leaving. And it just makes things worse. So here's it, we're all wrestling with the problems, and it's difficult and hot in Rome. But this is a way of thinking. So this is a point that was made by a Bulgarian conservator. We used to think of rigidity, think of flexibility. We used to think of expert team, now think of stakeholders. So stakeholders, identifying stakeholders is difficult. So maybe we should see this as an opportunity to utilise conservation to unite communities. And as young conservators, I think you should, if you're aware of this early in your career, you can really sort of get on top of this. Bottom-up New World Order. So we shouldn't be cynically engaging with our preconceived agenda in the hopes of securing funding, because people will realise that. Term conservation is problematic. For some people it can be preserve an aspect, expensive obstacle to change. It involves discussion and consultation. So we've got all of these charters. We can see that the charters, if you look at a charter and ask yourself who wrote it and what was their vested interest in writing that charter, and then you can understand it. Because they're basically the Athens Charter with changes, modification that reflect the times in which they were written. So have a lot of rethinking, expert, top-down. So it's in social engagement. So, and research findings. So we have to share those research findings in a meaningful way. So that might mean that we have to leave the bench and that we have to sit around with, finger painting, joining in Maori dance celebrations, doing sleepovers, all sorts of things to really get to understand and enjoy and interacting with it. So successful projects embed expertise within the community. You train the community to have an understanding, imparted knowledge and skills, and engage young people. Because you engage a young person and you have them for the next 50 years safeguarding that heritage asset. People are keen to participate in heritage projects because they want to understand the past and they want to contribute to the sense of place. And also, they enjoy interaction in a social environment with experts, because they don't often get to meet experts. So if you can present yourself as an expert who's also a person, who has a drink or two and laughs, it's very well. So radical, I'm suggesting new skills are required for conservation, radical paradigm shift. And excitement. I think we all get excited about our work, and professionals must be able to convey their own excitement about the building. Enthusiasm is infectious, because we can't be there all the time. If there's something really special, pick on somebody in the community, infect them with why this is special, so when you leave, they'll be there to safeguard it. The goal, this is it. The long-term aim, maintenance, management, all that stuff we were talking about, the long-term aim of a heritage professional is to create sustainable, pragmatic management systems, then walk away having empowered the community. So it does, a degree of altruism, you're not going to, if you're thinking, oh, well, they want me back for the management plan. No, you try and get it so self-sustaining so you don't have to go back at all. No? It's a very generous thing to do. Living heritage is a process. But so I'll just sort of go back to Deptford. So we obviously didn't engage with the stakeholders here. And the solution we gave into the interior, we insisted that the unpainted stucco was left. And then, because we couldn't get all of the paint off the walls, we kind of painted it in the colour that the unpainted stucco might have looked like originally. Now they will get an organ, and the organ will be put over that, but we've lost the pretty blue and gold that the little old ladies like, and they don't like this. So I'm not particularly proud of this particular project, and if I was doing it again, I'd start with having teas and parties with everybody and stakeholders. Thank you.